Here we have Marshall, Michigan, a sweet little town where a penny still buys you 6 minutes on a meter. But even in this perfect little town, appearances can be deceiving, and the most charmed life can end in an instant. Once a year, the old US 27 Motor Tour cruises down Main Street in Marshall, Michigan. Poor Douglas Nielsen didn't make the parade this year. In fact, he stayed home, and that's when all the trouble began.
We were having some friends over at the house. We were going to run into town to get a pizza and pass by the house and mention to my friend I was riding with that this is Diane King's house.
Doug's friend is impressed.
Diane King was our neighbor. She was the Channel 41 news anchor and
Good morning, everyone.
Somewhat of a local celebrity.
But when the boys return home with a piping hot pizza, Doug can tell something is amiss.
There was a couple of police cars in the driveway. There were canine dogs being led around the woods in and around our neighborhood there, and it occurred to us that everything isn't okay.
What Doug doesn't know is that just a few moments earlier, the Marshall Police Department fielded a panicked phone call from the King home.
Where's the address of your emergency?
Detective Guy Picketts is one of the first to respond.
Dispatch put out a call as an unknown trouble call at 16240 Division Drive. An unknown trouble call could be anything. It could be a person down, a cat up in a tree. It could be literally anything.
Detective Picketts has no idea what he'll encounter, but he won't have any trouble finding the home.
I was familiar with that address because I had lived there for a number of years.
But now it is the home of news anchor Diane King, her husband Brad, and their 2 children.
I just thought it was like maybe fate that I was being sent to that location.
But fate is about to deliver a cruel blow.
I drove up the driveway, approached the vehicle that was parked in the driveway. I observed that there was a female laying next to the vehicle. There were 2 kids crying in the back seat of the vehicle.
The woman on the ground is Diane King, and her husband Brad is frantic.
I hear somebody yelling from the porch, you know, help my wife, help my wife. I said, help's on the way.
But no one can help Diane now.
I knelt down. I observed that she had a small bit of blood around her nose. I checked for a pulse on her neck, and there was not any pulse.
Local celebrity Diane King is dead, and the situation is only getting worse.
The EMT pointed to a small wound in her chest and said, she's been shot. I immediately got onto my radio. I called dispatch. I asked for additional help.
Diane has been shot to death in her own driveway. But as sheriff's deputies race to the scene, the source of the deadly shot remains a mystery.
I had no clear idea as to what had happened at this residence.
Diane's husband, Brad, is brought down to the station for questioning. Meanwhile, speculation about the tragedy races through the little town.
I mean, it could have been a hunter and a stray shot. Well, if you're out, it could have been any one of a number of things. So, I mean, it's possible that it was just an accident. I don't know.
Marshall has lost its celebrity news anchor. And Nancy Gwynn has lost a friend.
She wanted to not be a celebrity. She wanted to be a friend. She was a beautiful person. She was good inside. She was so good inside.
Back at the station, Detective Jim Stadfeld immediately gets a statement from the only person there that night, Diane's husband, Brad.
Brad stated to us that he had been at home, that Diane had gone to Detroit to visit her family. He stated that prior to her getting back at the residence, he decided to go for a walk, that he had heard a couple of shots, but he didn't seem to be overly concerned about those. There was some hunting that went on behind there, obviously would have been good deer hunting. Had started back to the residence, noticed Diane's vehicle in the driveway, and then noticed her lying on the ground.
Was Diane simply the victim of a hunter's bullet gone astray?
It's a pretty rural area. There was quite a bit of hunting or shooting around there because it wasn't uncommon to hear gunshots.
Still, a hunting accident seems unlikely. Just to be sure, Detective Stadfeld and his partner study the autopsy,
We just got the autopsy report back.
and it reveals a shocking detail.
It shows that Diane was shot twice, not just once.
One shot could be an accident. 2 shots looks like murder. The location of the second shot is significant as well.
The second shot was actually just above the pelvic area, which is kind of unique in the fact that there really wasn't a kill shot because she was already down. Why, when she's already on the ground, are you going to take a second shot anyway?
That makes me think it was very personal, and it was definitely intentional. Whatever reason, that person had a score to settle.
And that can only mean one thing.
This was somebody who was very familiar with Diane, that really didn't like Diane and was telling her, this is for you.
Nearly everybody in town knows Marshall's favorite anchorwoman. But who knew Diane best? Her loving husband, Brad.
Brad taught criminal justice at Western Michigan. He had been a police officer in Pontiac, Michigan for a few years.
Did this former cop try to pull off the perfect crime? That's coming up next on Suburban Secrets. Sunday in Marshall, Michigan is a time for families to take a stroll, for grandparents to spoil grandchildren, and for Nancy Gwynn to lose, yet again, to her sister Phyllis at cards.
How come you always play more than I do?
But since the murder of Nancy's dear friend, Diane King, losing at cards seems a petty thing.
Who really and truly could have believed that something this horrific could happen here in Marshall, in our town?
Well, if this can happen, what else can?
For the tiny police department in this tiny town, this is the crime of the century.
Marshall is a quiet community where I think most people are still very comfortable in leaving their homes unlocked as they go away. Probably isn't the wisest thing to do, but I think 95% of the time, everything's fine.
But not this time. Investigators have determined that Diane King's murder was most likely a crime of passion, which means
Brad King could have very well been involved in this crime.
Brad is a criminal justice professor and a former cop, which may explain his demeanor.
Brad was very subdued, and he was asked about that, about his demeanor. And his answer was, I was a policeman once. I teach criminal justice. I understand how this works. I need to be unemotional so that I can relay the information to you as best I can.
Furthermore, Brad has no apparent motive for the senseless killing.
Everything seemed to be fairly good within the marriage. He was making fairly good money. Diane wasn't making a lot of money, but he said they were pretty happy.
But now, a cold-blooded sniper has wrecked the King's happy home. And he's still out there. Investigators return to the King property, searching for clues to the killer's identity.
We knew that Diane had been shot twice. The bullets that were recovered from Diane were .22 caliber bullets, and we needed to try to determine where those shots came from.
And when investigators make their way into the barn, they find a shining needle in a haystack.
We found a .22 caliber shell casing up in the hayloft of the barn right there on the property, within 70 or 80 feet of where Diane lay on the ground. We felt pretty comfortable that was where the shot came from.
It's a major discovery that gives new insight into Diane's killer.
The person probably was a fairly good shot because it wasn't something where you walked up and you were 10 feet away from someone. You're 75, 80 feet away. Someone did a lot of planning. They had picked out that location.
But there's one key piece of the puzzle that remains elusive.
We were really hoping that we would find the weapon there.
The murder weapon is nowhere to be found. And investigators are starting to worry.
The most challenging part of this investigation was not being able to find a lot of physical evidence.
With the investigation at a standstill, an unsettling rumor begins circulating around town. Perhaps Diane's perfect life was not so perfect
I heard she was stalked.
I had heard that also. I can't imagine.
Weird letters and...
Well, she was a pretty famous news anchor, right?
Mm-hmm. Guess that's fame. You got people watching you.
I mean, how scary for her and her family.
I'd be scared to be at the house by myself or with just the kids.
Who knows? They're still out there, obviously.
And this time, the rumors are true.
Diane had received a letter which was cut out of newspapers, magazines, that kind of thing. It praised her looks, her body. It asked for an autograph. It had been placed in her mailbox. There was no postmark, no stamp. So someone had actually had to drive it up to their residence, which obviously scared her.
That really bothered her because she said, whoever is doing this knows where I live. She kept thinking, what's the next thing that's going to happen?
After that, Diane started getting these strange phone calls.
Perhaps investigators have missed a deadly warning sign.
We were concerned if whoever had been writing these letters was actually a stalker, if this person could have actually been a perpetrator in this particular crime.
Did Diane's mysterious stalker take his obsession too far?
Good morning, everyone.
Ah, fame. The glitz, the glamour, the stalkers. It appears that local celebrity Diane King may have had a murderous stalker of her own.
Diane had received some threats over the previous months, and that had not been solved as far as who had actually perpetrated those threats. So that went through my mind. Did we actually have a stranger homicide of someone who was well known in our area?
Could Diane have paid the ultimate price for her celebrity status?
Things were getting bad. And she was getting phone calls at work, and she was getting the letters, and bothered her to the point that she didn't want to get out of her car by herself.
With no clues as to the stalker's identity, Detective Jim Stadfeld and first responder Guy Picketts pore over the details of the crime, hoping for a break.
This is the barn where the shooting appears.
The suspect was, yeah.
Right.
There was a dog tied up to the back of this barn, wasn't there?
Well, actually, the dog was in the barn, tied in the tack room. It seems kind of odd to me that the dog
would have let somebody buy him.
Yeah.
A faithful dog who doesn't bark when a stranger invades his lair? How very, very odd.
Here's the other thing. How's a stranger going to know when Diane's going to return home? There's only, as far as we know, one person that knows when she's returning home, and that's Brad.
Perhaps this is not the work of a stalker after all. Maybe there's some truth to the latest rumors about Diane's husband, Brad.
I remember seeing him wearing like fatigues and things, and he just always seemed like he wanted to be the center of attention.
I've also heard that he's been seeming more and more resentful of her success. And
well, she was good on the news.
Yeah.
Diane's friend Nancy has a nose for news, and she's been smelling trouble lately in the King marriage.
As time went on, she seemed very unhappy because things were not happy at home.
As a college professor and former cop, Brad is an unlikely suspect. Or is he just an unusually clever one? Either way, he's certainly not going to win Grieving Husband of the Year.
Brad never called this police agency, called me, called anyone that I'm aware of, and wanted to know how the investigation was going forward as far as trying to find the person responsible for killing his wife.
And his behavior at the funeral is hardly appropriate.
I just thought it was strange that he didn't cry, that he didn't touch the casket. I mean, when I lost my mother, I would bonkers, and I had to touch the casket.
Investigators dig deeper, hoping to find a crack in this former cop's tough exterior.
We needed to go to Western Michigan University, where Brad was the criminal justice instructor, and search his office, which we'd obtained a search warrant for, and talk to some of his students just to see what was going on at that end of Brad's life.
There they uncover a shocking secret.
We were able to determine that two of the female students were currently having an affair with Brad.
Looks like the widower has been channeling his grief down a different path.
It certainly made us very suspicious of someone who supposedly should have been grieving for his wife.
But that's not all.
We had received an anonymous tip that there had been a gal who was at a hotel in Marshall who was going to meet up with Brad the day after the homicide. And it was one of the students that he had been having an affair with.
If Brad thought he could hide this incriminating detail from investigators, he was dead wrong.
Brad was the type of individual who thought that he was smarter than our whole police agency or any police agency in this area. He had come from a large metropolitan area. He taught criminal justice. He's much smarter than all of us.
Even still, things are looking rather bad for clever Brad. But jealousy and infidelity won't exactly stand up in court. Local prosecutor John Solly needs more.
I've done over 40 murder trials. In my experience, the more physical evidence that you present, things that the jury can see and touch, the better your chances of conviction are.
Investigators must find the missing murder weapon, most likely a .22 caliber rifle, and they need to link Brad to it.
As we were leaning more towards Brad as a suspect, if he had secured it back on this property, we certainly wanted to find it before he had the opportunity to go back, secure it, and then move it in a location where we may have never discovered it.
Can the missing murder weapon be found? Or will the criminal justice profession be one step ahead of the law? Diane King's husband, Brad, is now the primary suspect in her murder. But this wily character won't be easy to pin down.
We felt that Brad was really playing a game with our investigation from the standpoint that Brad had been a police officer. Brad was a criminal justice instructor. Pretty obvious to us that he didn't think our department could perhaps solve this crime.
Now, investigators race to the farm for one more desperate search for the murder weapon.
We felt there could have been a fairly good chance that the weapon may be out there. We grouped up here, a large group of deputies, went back to the scene, began a search.
And this time, they hit pay dirt.
Probably within about 30 minutes, the gun was discovered. It was barreled down into a small creek right next to the bank.
It's a miraculous find.
We were a little lucky in this one. We retrieved the weapon and took it to the crime lab and turned it over to them for analysis. The lab report said that the casings were fired from a very similar weapon, if not that particular weapon itself.
But there is one small problem. There are no fingerprints or other identifying information on the rifle. Investigators have found their likely murder weapon, but they're still no closer to proving that Brad was the killer.
We had conducted a number of interviews, upwards of probably 100, trying to either remove this weapon from Brad or to place it to Brad.
And finally, prosecutor John Solly gets what he's been after.
There was a young man who had mowed the lawn at the King residence who had seen a .22 caliber rifle at the King residence. Brad King had indeed owned a .22 caliber rifle. That was very important evidence.
Although the case is still circumstantial, it's enough. Brad King is arrested and charged with first-degree murder. For investigators, the tragic events of that Saturday afternoon have finally come into focus.
Diane had gone to Detroit to be with family, took the children with her. Diane called him late in the afternoon, said, "I'm on my way home." He turned the lights on in the house, which would make Diane believe someone was there, that Brad was there. He went out into the barn, secured himself, got himself ready. Diane pulls into the driveway, gets out, turns to the back door to retrieve her children. Brad fired the fatal shot. Killed her.
Investigators even have a theory about Diane's mysterious stalker.
We felt that Brad very well used this initial letter that Diane had received to create this stalker. He had subsequently made the phone calls to Diane, and he had created that whole atmosphere, which led up to him being able to commit the homicide and blame it onto a stalker.
That Brad is a clever crook indeed. But now, he's about to become the smartest inmate in the Michigan correctional system. After a 6-week trial, Brad King is convicted and sentenced to life. Life has returned to normal once again in Marshall, Michigan.
Yeah, I guess Brad might have gotten what's coming to him.
But Diane's family and friends are still haunted.
His eyes always bothered me. To me, if you look at a person, you know a person is kind or not by looking at their eyes. And his eyes were not that way.
There once was a nasty man who thought he was smarter than everyone else. But everyone knows there's no such thing as the perfect crime. The truth always outsmarts you in the end.